All right, we're ready to get started. Good evening, and thank you for spending some time with us to learn about this issue this evening. My name is Annette Leba, and I'm the Technical Services Division Administrator at the Oregon Water Resources Department. I'm going to introduce the team that has been working on this rulemaking. First, Laura Hart, who's the rulemaking coordinator and policy analyst, and then Justin Iverson, our groundwater section manager. So you probably heard the announcement that this part of the evening is being recorded. It will be available on our website along with all the other informational sessions that we have done prior to the official public hearing. The public hearing will also be recorded and will also be available on our website. So everybody who has a name tag like this on is a Oregon Water Resources Department employee. So if you need help, feel free to grab somebody with a name tag. I want to just kind of go over how the evening's going to go. So first we have an informational session. That's about 35 minutes. And then there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. That is not part of the official public hearing record. So I'd like to ask that you please hold your questions until after Justin finishes his presentation, and we will conclude the presentation and the question and answers at 6:30. If there are questions that we don't get to in that time frame, we do have some index cards that you can write questions on, and we can also summarize those and post those on our website. When we do get to the questions, I'll try to help Justin facilitate them, and I'll call on you. It'd be great to know who you are and what your interest in water is. Justin also has been coached that if your question seems more like a comment, he's going to remind you to submit that during the public comment period. And again, the informational session will conclude at 6:30, and then we will start with the public comment period at 7 o'clock. If you want to submit comments during the public comment period, you need to please sign up on the sign up sheet out front. I also just want to acknowledge that you are welcome to submit written comments to the department until 5 o'clock June 14th. And then finally, there are restrooms out here in the hall, and in the break room, which is across the hall from the restrooms, there's also a drinking fountain if you're thirsty. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Justin.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Again, my name is Justin Iverson. I manage the groundwater section at the Oregon Water Resources Department. And as Annette just mentioned, giving a general informational presentation about, just real briefly, groundwater in Oregon, some of the problems we're seeing, and that'll lead us into why we are proposing to change the rules about how we allocate new groundwater rights, and talk about the details of the two major components of that. And then we'll kind of finish up, and happy to answer questions folks might have. So with that, I'll start with a general introduction. Like to start out with water cycle because most everybody's familiar with it and seen it at some point. And for the purposes of what we're discussing today, groundwater, that is one flowing component of the hydrologic cycle. So the part there in the lower left where precipitation enters the ground, that's been happening for a very long time, and that constant input over the years puts some driving pressure on the groundwater, and that drives it to flow someplace. So groundwater is flowing, and with the constant input, there has to be some output somewhere, or it would spill over onto the ground. And in Oregon, that is generally discharged to springs or stream flow, what we call base flow. There's some seepage directly into the streams. And today I'll say the word hydraulic connection a bunch. And what I'm meaning is that interface where groundwater discharges to surface water in this part of the hydrologic cycle. So when we talk about pumping and we install a well into our little picture here, that well is typically, in many places in Oregon, not all, but typically pumping water that is flowing along that groundwater flow path and pulling it up from along that flow path and diverting it to growing crops or city municipal water for people to drink or what have you. And so I'm going to kind of re-emphasize this again, but when we pump groundwater that is flowing and hydraulically connected to surface water, we're taking it away from that flow path, and that means there's less water downstream going to those surface water bodies. So I'm going to say that one more time, but with a picture this time. This is a picture of a spring along the Metolius River. Again, hopefully it's intuitive that if we install a well just above the spring and we pump it, we're going to be taking water away from what would otherwise be spring discharge. So we can push that well up the hill further away. We'll spread that impact out over time. We'll spread it out over distance, perhaps, or stream length or reach. But it will eventually, the amount of water we pump out of that well is going to be that much water less coming out of this spring flow. And if we install multiple wells, then it's cumulative. So pumping from 4 wells is going to be 4 times as much depletion before we hit that spring discharge. So that's water that we're diverting that would otherwise be in the stream and available to that stream flow and users of that stream flow. And develop multiple wells across the state we have. This series of maps is a density map. Each dot shows a number of wells per square mile. The yellow colors have more than 300 wells per square mile, going down to the purple colors, which is 1 to 16. So you can see how since 1955, which is when the state initiated its Groundwater Act and started regulating groundwater statewide with water rights, we've installed a bit more than 250,000 wells over that time. And those wells supply water to a number of different things. And so I use this plot mostly to point out 2 things. So this is percent of total, the blue bars is percent of total wells by type. And I realize that might be small to see. The red bars are percent of use by type. And on the bottom, we've got the different types. So on the left is domestic wells, and that set of wells, these are wells that don't require a water right. They are exempt from the permitting process. That makes up about 88% of the wells that have been installed since 1955, but they have a relatively small total use. So total estimated use from that almost 90% of all wells is about 4%. Stepping over to the next set of bars, that's showing irrigation uses. And about 7% of all water wells are drilled for irrigation purposes. Those generally do require a permit in order to pull water out and use it. They're generally larger capacity wells. Estimated total use about 82% of the total use annually. And then a few more, but the take home is about 10% of all water wells drilled in the state are permitted, and they account for about 95% of the total use. And what we're talking about today with this groundwater allocation rulemaking will affect future wells that desire to have a water right to use relatively large capacity. It doesn't affect any existing wells. So the 250,000 existing wells aren't impacted by this rulemaking, and it doesn't impact exempt use wells. So wells for domestic supply is the most common use. Those will not be affected by this rulemaking going forward.
And I'll note this presentation's on our website, so I see people taking photos, so just know you can find it there as well.
Yeah. So why do we need this rulemaking that we're here to talk about tonight? So again, we've developed a lot of groundwater across the state. It's been more densely developed in some places than others, and where we've developed densely or where we've developed in a place where there's not a lot of natural through flow, we see what we call over allocation, where we've issued water rights for use in excess of what the capacity of the system is without causing these undesirable impacts. So we're seeing wells that dry up, or at the very least, if we're pumping so much that water levels are falling, it costs more just to pump that water to the surface and use it. Again, where we have hydraulically connected streams, stream flow suffers from that. It leads us to curtail rights that people have invested in, which is definitely undesirable. Also can lead to deterioration of water quality in some cases. And we see these signs of overallocation across the state. So this map just shows places where we have water level records that show that water levels have dropped 50 feet or more from their highest known levels. Again, clustered in some spaces, but distributed throughout the state. Another map showing where we have received complaints of dry wells. So I want to be clear that dry wells can happen for a number of reasons, but certainly in some reasons that's happening directly due to pumping nearby of large capacity wells, again, clustered in some places, but present throughout the state. And then again, going out to where groundwater impacts surface water, this map shows where surface water is available in August. So again, that groundwater discharge to surface water as a percent of surface water flow is generally largest in the summertime when we don't see a lot of rain. Groundwater makes up a higher percent of that lower stream flow. And throughout the state, for the most part, in August, we have fully allocated those surface water supplies. And again, where groundwater is creating that surface water, that means that water is accounted for. And the last set of these series I'll show, this map shows real broadly where water masters are curtailing back existing surface water users in our prior appropriation system. So throughout much of this area, as well as the eastern part of the state, water masters are curtailing back streams to the 1800s. So we've already issued water rights in excess of available physical water availability before even the 1900s in some streams in some cases. So all those things are undesirable, and we are recognizing that we can't just keep issuing water rights for additional new uses on top of these existing uses that are already not all the time having their water needs met. And so we embarked on this rulemaking with an objective to update our groundwater allocation rules. Again, allocation is new water rights for new uses, such that we could be more sustainable and protective of the existing users, right, to honor our prior appropriation system. When we started on this rulemaking process, we started with our statutory authorities. This is in statute, the legislature has put forward what we colloquially call a four-part test for water, whether or not we should issue a new groundwater right. Of those four parts, we're really focused on only one, which is water available for further allocation. So all of our rulemaking proposed changes focus on this is water available, part of the four-part test. And right now, our current rules say that a requested source is available if it's not over appropriated. So essentially that means that right now our rules say we will issue new rights all the way up until we cross some threshold of having these undesirable results that we just talked about. And then we'll both stop issuing new rights at the same time we have to address that over allocation. So we're gonna issue new right up to the point where we say, oh, whoa, too far, and then we'll start pulling it back. And when we've issued rights to folks that they invest in to develop and then have to pull those rights back in the prior appropriation system, that's a really painful thing that we want to avoid. So some of the details of that current set of rules is first bullet here on the left, allocate up to the full annual recharge volume. So again, if you can picture that water cycle that we showed, essentially the rules say everything that comes in at the top of that system and is flowing through, we can issue a water right for every bit of that. And of course, that would mean that nothing gets past it to come out to the stream. So it's basically saying, you know, issue anything that is supporting stream flow. the department recognized that back in the 80s. We put in place a relatively newer set of rules that we call our Division 9 rules. We said, hey, we don't want to cause acute short-term impact to these surface water supplies. But our current rules allow us to continue to issue groundwater rights that develop impacts over long periods of time, over longer than a year. It also doesn't address cumulative impacts from multiple wells. It looks at an impact on a well by well by well basis. So the proposed rules here on the right-hand side take a different view of water is available and asks 3 questions, and these 2 that are at the top that are highlighted, I'll spend quite a bit more time on a little bit later. But essentially, it says that a requested groundwater source through a new application for a water right is only available if groundwater levels are reasonably stable, if hydraulically connected surface water is available for further appropriation, and if the aquifer is physically capable of producing the requested rate. So that, in a nutshell, is the proposed rulemaking that we're here to take comment on today. So real quick on process, we started this rulemaking process, I suppose, in December of 2021 with a conversation with our commission. We took a bunch of public outreach meetings, including one in this room back in 2022, asked for folks' input on what they wanted to see. Then we put together a draft set of the rules. We pulled together a rules advisory committee in April of 23, had 8 meetings with them plus 2 technical sessions, and have done a bunch of additional outreach. That RAC is pretty diverse. This is a rundown of its roster. I'm not going to read everybody here, but lots of different viewpoints. We got a lot of great feedback from the RAC that helped us edit and improve the rules over time. So want to recognize them and their contributions. So I said I was going to spend more time on those 2 highlighted issues. This is the first of them, defining reasonably stable groundwater levels. This is a statutory term that has been in the statutes since 1955, where the legislature said reasonably stable water levels shall be determined and maintained, but we've never defined them to date, and so we've never been able to apply them because there's not a specific definition of what does that mean. And so in looking at what that might mean, this is a picture that gives kind of a model. So reasonably stable water levels isn't a water level that's persistent through time. Groundwater will naturally respond to variations in precipitation. So annual wet dry periods in the year. We have a generally 10-year wet and dry climate cycle. We've got El Nino and La Nina cycles. And that means that water levels, that are represented by the blue squiggly line here, are naturally going up and down on various timescales in response to the climate. And in this blue bar here is labeled dynamically stable range. That is what we tried to capture for our definition of reasonably stable groundwater levels. And we did that by taking a look at existing data. We've got data from more than 9,000 wells across the state with some amount of water level data. We narrowed that down to places where we've had a record of 25 years or more. So we want to capture the response of groundwater levels to that decadal climate cycle, that 10-year climate cycle. And we assessed those to make sure we were confident that they were responding to climate. And in taking a look at all of those wells, we landed on a definition for the rules of saying that reasonably stable means that any rates of decline, during dry climate cycles would be 0.5 foot a year or less over a 5 to 20 year period. And to make sure that we weren't allowing for slow, long declines, we put a total decline threshold on of 25 feet. And those parameters describe more than 90% of wells statewide. And we performed a statistical analysis to assess, hey, where those 10% don't quite meet these, are they clustered anywhere? Is there any, particular reason for that? And we didn't find any spatial bias there. So we're confident that this is a relatively good capture of the vast majority of wells that we'll see, assuming that the future is similar to the past. So this slide summarizes the proposed changes that we're making to the rules to define reasonably stable water levels. So again, we've defined water level declines no more than half a foot a year, 25 feet total, from the highest known water levels. So we set that reference level at the wettest swing. And we set some minimum thresholds. So we've got to have data for at least 5 years to calculate that trend or to apply this test. That water level data doesn't have to be from the particular well on a water right application. It can be from a neighboring well in the same aquifer. And there has to be some amount of data in the last 5 years, so it has to be relatively recent. We have to compare it to what's happening today or within the last 5 years. As we went through and had discussions with our Rules Advisory Committee, we added some additional considerations. So we wanted to exclude any water levels that might be responding to man-made events. So down in this neck of the woods, when Immigrant Reservoir went in, water levels rose around that area because we were stopping up surface water. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't artificially setting a high level to compare to. Also, we put in a caveat that if there was a proposed development in an area where there hadn't been any groundwater development we were aware of, we would assume that that water levels were in equilibrium with the climate. We would assume they were relatively stable. And lastly, we reaffirmed that basin program rules, which are local rules to administrative river basins, could have another definition of reasonably stable if it went through that basin rulemaking process and considered the impacts on existing wells, ecosystems, and long-term sustainability of the resource. So this is an example of how that might look or might be applied, these new rules. So this is a hydrograph in the Harney Basin, where on the left-hand side, you can see the black dots are water levels that are rising and falling relatively gently over time from the 70s to about the 90s. And in about the 90s, we crossed some threshold where we issued more water rights than the system could maintain, and water levels started falling. So we actually stopped issuing water rights here in 2012 when water levels had fallen about 50 feet, met that threshold of decline excessively. Under the proposed rules, we would have stopped issuing back in 2007. So that transition from the blue to the orange is where we where the thresholds would be tripped from these proposed new rules. And while we still would have over appropriated a little bit, we issued another 2,500 acres roughly in between that intervening period. And right now we're in the process in the Harney Basin of establishing what's called a critical groundwater area. That's the method by which we curtail back uses. And we're going to have to curtail back that 2,500 acres and then some. So when we over appropriate, I just want to get this across again, we're setting people up to make investments that they might not be able to pay off in the long term, right? If we have to curtail back to ensure that senior users get the water that they're entitled to in our prior appropriation system. So another item that this addresses is dry well complaints. So since July of 21, we've had about 1,200 dry well complaints. A lot of them down in this area, also the Klamath Basin. We've set up a number of programs to support folks that need to deepen these dry domestic wells. Average cost has been about $26,000 per well for people that have applied to that program. We've spent $9 million plus in public investments, but there's ongoing demand. So again, the more we can avoid this, the better off we're going to be just in general. The bottom here, we took a look at the statewide risk of wells going dry and found that about 15,000 of the total wells, so this is the about 250,000 wells that I showed on the slide of Oregon with the density map, about 15,000 of those are completed only 25 feet below the water table. So those 15,000 wells are at risk. I'm not saying that water levels across the whole state are going to drop and we're going to have that many, but just that's how many we have that aren't completed much deeper than 25 feet. And if we look at 50 feet, we're up to 55,000 wells. So there's a significant number of existing domestic users depending on groundwater systems that are at risk of going dry if we don't maintain reasonably stable water levels. Okay, I'm going to switch to number 2. Again, redefining this term in rule, which is potential for substantial interference with surface water. I'm going to describe this in a story. So this is Eagle Creek. It's a place that I enjoy visiting in the late summer when it's hot, when it hasn't rained in a few months. I can always count on there being water in Eagle Creek if I go visit it, but there's no snowpack above Eagle Creek. Again, very little precipitation in the intervening couple months, no dams or other storage, and yet it's always running. And it's running because this is water that has fallen over the watershed, soaked into the ground, takes a while to flow to the lowest point, which is the creek, and it comes out. So this picture is essentially groundwater. That's all groundwater that's coming out and flowing. And people rely on that. So that stream flow is relied upon by a fish hatchery downstream, and then it's taken out for irrigation further down. This stream is fully allocated, so there's no more surface water available for additional uses. And I should really say it's over allocated because the water master has told me that she regulates back even 1970s water right holders on this stream in about 3 out of every 4 years. And so this is, again, groundwater that is being relied upon by folks. And yet, under our current rules, we have continued to issue groundwater rights to folks that aren't right up next to the stream, but are a ways away, but still pumping from groundwater flow paths that are supporting this stream flow. And so these new proposed rules take a different view and they say, hey, if a person is applying for a new groundwater right that is from a groundwater flow path that's hydraulically connected to a stream, can the stream handle more appropriation? So is there water still available, or have we essentially allocated that groundwater just further downstream? Just another example, this is the Sprague River up in the Northern Klamath Basin. Want to acknowledge that there is snowmelt in this stream. It's not 100% stream flow, but we have shown that this stream does receive quite a bit of groundwater discharge directly to support that flow. And again, that stream is curtailed back from almost all surface water uses every year since at least 2014. And groundwater irrigators can continue to pump their groundwater. So again, this rulemaking isn't going to affect any existing water users, but in situations like this, we won't issue additional water rights that would continue to make the problem worse. So I want to reiterate that this rulemaking is all about piling on additional water rights that will continue to nick away at these water sources that already aren't meeting our existing needs. So in a nutshell, the proposed rules or rule changes associated with groundwater surface water interference say that they basically redefine this potential for substantial interference. And they say if proposed groundwater use is hydraulically connected, over the proposed period of use, and again, many groundwater systems are hydraulically connected, but not all in the state, then the potential for substantial interference exists. And if that's the case, then we're going to look to the health of the stream to see if water is available. So is there surface water? Would we issue another surface water right out of that groundwater supported surface water body? Is withdrawn or classified? Does it get regulated off by the water master to satisfy senior users? Does it have an unmet in-stream water right during any period of the year? So implications for that. Again, going back to the map where I showed surface water availability, where tan meant that there wasn't surface water available, that's a big chunk of the state. And again, not all streams in Oregon are supported by groundwater, but a good proportion are. And so if promulgated, these rules are going to result in us issuing less new water rights than we currently do today. And that means we're going to need to meet our future needs in other ways than simply adding more straws to the system. So there's a lot of existing options out there: conservation, subsurface recharge, groundwater reuse. We have a robust transfer program, and there's a lot of potential of new future opportunities. So things we've heard about in our basin planning efforts are mitigation programs similar to what the Deschutes Basin has, market-based approaches, and other types of outcomes. That being said, we believe that this rulemaking has a lot of benefits to existing users. It's going to increase certainty for those existing users. So again, existing water right holders who might not be having their water needs met every year are going to have a better security that we aren't going to keep kind of partitioning out these limited supplies to more and more folks, or at least in more and more water rights. We think that the rules are going to lead to fewer dry wells, lower pumping cost, and in some cases preserved water quality. I think most important is, I believe the new rules are more consistent with our prior appropriation system. They're going to protect senior existing users, and that's going to reduce future conflicts and the need to curtail off folks that have made investments in water systems. So with that, as Annette mentioned up at the top of the show here, we're holding a number of public meetings. This is the third, our last, or public hearings, excuse me. Last one's going to be in Salem next week. Written comments, however, will be accepted through June 14th. So you can always provide written comments. We'll evaluate those in June or July. We expect to evaluate those comments, make any last changes to the rules, and propose a final set of rule changes to the commission in September. And with that, there's more information, a lot of information online. I believe that this website and such is in the handouts that are outside, so you don't necessarily have to click it. And with that, happy to take the next 25-30 minutes and answer any questions folks have.
And because we're recording, if you have a question, please wait until I bring you the microphone. So, questions? And again, if you could indicate who you are, like an interest in water, that'd be great.
Holly Morton, and interest in water is protecting the citizens' rights. I'm curious what scientific communities you rely on in order to come up with the data that you have.
Oh, okay. We collect data from a number of sources. And I think, well, the department, first of all, collects a lot of data. We have 12,000 active monitoring wells across the state that we collect data annually or more frequently. We also rely upon data measured by water users. So lots of newer water rights have a requirement to measure water levels and report that data to the state. So that augments what we know. And all of that is available online for everybody to use. We also put that into the context of the geologic system. And that information typically comes from published reports that are peer-reviewed by the state geologic agency, the United States Geological Survey, universities, consultants for large operations, what have you. So we take all that into account in a particular individual water right application, anything that the applicant submits, we take into account. And I'm sure that there's more that I'm missing, so.
And actually, I'm just gonna add here, so, Justin talked about the methodology for establishing reasonably stable water levels. That methodology is documented in a paper that's on our website and was peer reviewed by the US Geological Survey. So we did work with them in that methodology. So I saw somebody else had their hand up here.
I got here a little bit late, so there's a lot I don't know. But it sounds, okay. So every time somebody wants to build a house on property that is not part of a city or water system,
Mhm.
they have to depend on a well or tanking the water. And so to build, to drill a well, they have to get approval from you?
No, for individual properties that have what we would call a self-serve domestic well, that use is exempted from the permitting process by the legislature. So they do, you have to meet a minimum set of well construction requirements, and those are intended to protect the resource from contamination or runoff of manure or what have you. But you don't need a water right to put in a well for a domestic purpose or a number of other relatively small uses. So stock watering, single use industrial, what have you.
Okay.
Kevin Gill, Oregon Groundwater Association, files for drilling. Justin, does the department consider a 5-foot water level decline the same in a water well that has a 500-foot water column as a good well that has a 60-foot water column?
Sorry, I would almost ask you to, I mean, the short answer is yes, but go a little further so we can.
Well, you got a 600-foot well that has a 100-foot static. You got a 500-foot water column. You got an 80-foot well.
Yeah.
With a 20-foot static. Is there any consideration to percentage change, or is it just straight up water level decline in feet?
Yeah, so and I'm going to relate this to the reasonably stable water level definition. We are looking at essentially the water table and how it fluctuates over time, and we are not there's no calculation for how much is below that, and that's for a couple of different reasons. First one is majority of wells are not, you know, super deep, and so we want to be protective of existing users that depend on that water column within reason. We've got some limits on, well, I won't go too far into that. But the real thing is if water levels start to fall and they fall beyond this reasonably stable criteria, we expect them to keep falling through time. And so once you pass that criteria, looking backward at all of our available information, more than 90% of wells fluctuate within that 25 feet. And it doesn't matter if the aquifer is, 50 feet or 500 feet. Once you break that threshold, it is likely that it will just continue to drop. And so overall, that's going to mean that folks have to chase the water if we allow that to go on. And that's not the situation we want to be in.
Thank you.
Yep.
As you started to show, or my name is Kevin Crispin, and I'm just a property owner in Jackson County. And I have a small garden, that sort of thing. And as you're pointing out, it's an incredibly complex system. And so what you're doing is you're trying to manage an incredibly complex system that farmers typically have a good knowledge of what their land can do and what it can't do. And the fear, I think, of most of us is that this is a restriction that's coming down when the water is supposed to belong to the people. suddenly the keys are being handed over to an agency who is controlling that for people. There's a fear of that. You're gonna get pushback on that. And so what would you say to that, that your management of it just creates bureaucracy? There's a reasonable amount of it, but I think it's the overreach where people have a fear. So what would you say to that?
I suppose that from my perspective, the reason we have these rules is to ensure that all your neighbors, like not saying your neighbors, but all of the person's neighbors all have some right to access that. And because we have this prior appropriation system that was really established in the mid-1800s that values the person that was there first and using the water first and continually using that water for a beneficial use, our system continues to be set up to keep that promise, if you will, and protect those existing users. So I do not discount at all the local landowners' knowledge of their system. And I would say that this, again, protects the prior appropriation system as well as neighbors, and to try and ensure that everybody has, I don't want to say it's an equal access because it is a prior appropriation system, but some certainty in their access.
My name is Troy, and I'm 98% water. So earlier you said when we added dams, we raised the water level, the groundwater level. So is there any plan to add dams?
I can't speak to that right now. Well, I mean, not even right now. I'm not the groundwater manager, so I don't know. Damming is a complex process, so yeah. But
well, two things. The first one is the prior existing people, users. So it sounds like that the water right ties to the land, not the people that applied for it originally.
Yeah, that's correct.
So what you apply for a water right, it's in perpetuity. No matter how many hundreds of years pass. Is that what you're telling me?
As long as it's in relatively continual beneficial use, yes.
Then there's another thing too, is that the land use changes. Say it goes from a hay operation to say more of cattle on it, where you're not watering, large pivots every day. There's no accommodation for any kind of land use changes that would demand more or less water.
So I want to say yes and no. Every water right has kind of 4 components, and I'm gonna our water master staff back here are really the experts in this, so I'm gonna paraphrase, and hopefully they aren't like giving me bad looks. But you have a place of use, a type of use, place where you're diverting the water from, and total annual duty. And so your water right lays all that out. And again, that's your statement of beneficial use and how much and what your priority date was. We have a transfer system where if you want to change the location or where you're pulling water from or what have you, there is a method to go through and make changes to a water right. It can't result in injury to one of your neighbors. It can't result in enlargement. So you can't use a bunch more water. But again, water rights typically allow for some elasticity. There's like an upper limit, and most folks, I've been told, use less, but it fluctuates over the years with the climate and how much precipitation they get and other factors. So, short answer is there is a mechanism for change.
Yeah. And I'll just acknowledge when you do a transfer, and again, nobody here is from the Water Rights Division, so we are doing our best to share with you our understanding of their work. But when you do a transfer, it does retain its original appropriation date. So you are still in the same place in line. Other questions about groundwater?
Thank you. My name is Christopher Hall from Water League, and recently there's been a little kerfuffle in the news, and it's made its way across the state of Oregon and the United States of America about really what is exempt use and how does that differ from personal property and public assets. And so, can you talk a little bit about the 1955 Groundwater Act? Made all water in the state, including groundwater, public property, how that's different from possessory personal property? And what is the difference between that and having an exempt well that does not require getting the water right? Because I think that those issues are largely misunderstood. They only become further complicated by some recent events, and I think we could all benefit from just a few minutes on schooling on that. Thanks.
I don't know if you know what possessory property.
No, I
is.
won't. I'm
Justin,
not going to get into that. Yeah.
Please offer whatever awesome knowledge you have.
Yeah. So the legislature did declare that water in the state belongs to the public, and they license it for use with this prior appropriation system through water rights. And in statute, they said, but for domestic purposes, for livestock watering, for a single industrial commercial use, and a couple other exemptions, you don't need to get a permit for that, right? So if you remember my graph of blue and red bars, 90% of the water wells drilled in the state roughly are exempt from permitting, and the best estimate is they account for 5%-ish of the total groundwater use. So essentially my interpretation is the legislature just said, hey, for 90% of the users, it's a relatively small amount. We're gonna just grant you the ability to use that water. You still have a priority date in the system and what have you, but you don't have to go through the permitting process. Those exemptions do not cover irrigation of commercial crops. So you can grow a half acre or less of non-commercial lawn or garden, but to sell an irrigated crop requires a water right. And I think that's where the misunderstanding has come with the small farms issue.
I'm Christine Goodwin, state representative. So I believe we have 18 to 20 river basins, and we're wondering if this will be outside the legislature's hands. So we will making, excuse me, by the agency. I'm just wondering whether there will be considerations for regional management allocation, because we do have individual basins and regional differences in the state. So will it be a one size fits all, or will you consider those regional distinctions?
So I had pointed out earlier in the presentation to the statutory authority and the 4-part test. I'll put that back up here real quick. So there are this use is allowed in the basin, the top bullet there, that gets to what we call basin program rules. So each of these administrative basins does have a set of specific rules to that basin. And the proposed rulemaking acknowledges that those basin program rules can redefine these definitions through that process. So that process is available. And when we looked backward at all of our water level data for these threshold values, again, it covers 90% of all the existing wells that we've looked at fit within these criteria. And the 10% that don't are scattered here and there. They aren't concentrated in any particular place. So they exist in the wet coast, they exist in the dry southeast. And so from the perspective of a rule that's generally well known by all and that covers the vast majority of potential outcomes, we feel this is a good statewide threshold that, again, there is the possibility to change that, and that might need to be less. Like the example I gave of the Harney Basin, 25 feet honestly wasn't terribly protective, so they might choose to go smaller. Other places might try and go larger, as long as, again, we're taking into account the impacts on the existing wells and users, impacts on the ecosystem, and impacts on long-term sustainability, this statewide rule can be redefined in basin programs. Yep.
Robert Freeman, Jackson County Farm Bureau President. You said that in the nineties, you noticed this when the water table started to drop.
Yeah.
In '93, we had an earthquake over in the east side of the Cascades. And I know for a fact that there were artesian wells that stopped running the day after the earthquake, or within a few weeks.
Okay.
Has that been taken into consideration? And also the fact that the Hardy Basin, you can see the lake levels way before we were irrigating, and the water's been dropping. What has been decided to differentiate between them?
Sure. So in this particular example, so we just finished a multi-year groundwater study in conjunction with the USGS. This was not impacted by that earthquake, so I acknowledge what you said, and that sounds reasonable. But in this example, that's definitely not the case. We've got the water right issuance that really has taken some big step functions, and the first big step was in the 90s.
Groundwater levels have dropped way before we were irrigating to the degree that we're irrigating over now. I realize the pivots we've added.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I'm trying to parse your question. Like, essentially, the reasonably stable water level definition, the goal is, like, if you take your hand and you hold it up against there and you're just looking at, 1970 to 1990, we'd look at that little fluctuation, and irrigation was going on back then as well from groundwater, and we'd say, yeah, that's reasonably stable. And the goal is, like, if you move your hand just a little bit over to 2000, oh, we've got this drop. Is it going to come back up because, it's just a dry cycle in the climate or not? And looking at the climate impacts and kind of how wells have responded to it, we feel like we have given a pretty conservative estimate to help us predict the future in most cases.
So you take into consideration the rainfalls we had in the 70s versus what we had in the 90s, because they were substantially less in the 90s than they were in the 70s.
Yeah. So when we looked back again, the data that we looked at to come up with these thresholds, we required 25 years of data. It didn't necessarily cross the 70s to 90s, but we've had other wet and dry periods, again, roughly every 10 years. So we wanted to capture a wet dry cycle or two or more, and those are the records that we said, okay, 90% of those are described by these thresholds or don't exceed these thresholds.
Thank you, Emily McIntyre, State Representative for this area. 2 questions. When you put up a list of the people that have been engaged in this conversation, what level are supportive of these new rules and what are not? Who all on this list is supportive, they're promoting it, they're 100% behind it, and what amount of people on these are struggling with it?
Oh, I don't have the breakdown.
I would say it's a mix.
Yeah.
The goal of this rules advisory committee wasn't to achieve consensus, so it is there's definitely a mix.
There's a mix. Okay.
Yeah.
And then my other question, I feel like we've been going around with this, so I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Why is it that, especially with the Division 9, that because you're so clear, right, in our conversations that we're not doing anything that applies to anything that is currently existing at all. Why didn't we do a hard stop on those and leave them and then do a brand new Division 9.1 and create new going forward? Because it's muddled. It's still muddled in that Division 9.
And I would encourage you to make that comment.
I will, I'd like to know the answer. I'm so curious why,
Yeah, so I guess first I will say, people across the spectrum of this Rules Advisory Committee roster gave us feedback, and we incorporated feedback from the full spectrum. One piece of feedback we got from Glenn, quite frankly, was like, let's be super clear that we aren't affecting existing wells. And while we had tried to thread the needle, so potential for substantial interference, one of the goals of the rulemaking was to focus as much as we could just on new allocation, and we tried to do our best not to affect other things. And folks from other places, specifically the Deschutes Basin, where potential for substantial interference is redefined, if you will, in their basin program rules, getting to an earlier comment. And they have a defined mitigation program for that that depends on linking back to that terminology and those rule references. And so in order to not sever all of the links from all the other, not all the other, but many other divisions back to Division 9, we kept it in Division 9 and we kept the numbering roughly the same. So as to keep those things operable that folks relied upon. So that's why we did it there. And to just make sure that we were absolutely clear about not changing how, because Division 9 includes this bottom portion about potential regulation. In order to be crystal clear, we just readopted the whole darn thing at the bottom. Not very elegant, but hopefully very clear that it operates the same as it does today. So that was the goal, is trying to balance all those interests.
One more question.
Chris Holligan from Water League. In one of those just the facts, no emotions, please type of questions or answers rather. Can you tell me, in your technocratic professional engineering perspective, is this rules process coming a few days too late, or should this have been done in 5, 10, 15, 20 years earlier?
There's no technocratic answer to that question.
All right, and with that, I just want to, did you have a question?
Yeah.
We are at time, we'll take one more.
The question I have is sort of related to water theft. I think we all will acknowledge that the marijuana crops are a huge water need crop. And the illegal grows are particularly associated with water theft. So how do you take that into consideration in your overall program? Because that sounds almost like it's akin to a law enforcement problem.
I would encourage you to talk to Justin Dillon back.
I was going to say, yeah.
That very issue.
I mean, yeah, that's certainly the department is concerned about that from the perspective of these proposed rules for new uses. We want to do both, right? We want to have everybody using water legally according to the rules that we've got in place, as well as ensure that existing users are receiving the water that they hold rights to. So.
All right, thank you. And again, we are going to take a break and we will set up for the public hearing, which will start at 7 o'clock. So if you'd like to testify or submit oral comments, please go ahead and sign in on the sign-in sheet out front.